Hello everyone. Of all the franchises in gaming, The Legend of Zelda is definitely my favorite. Everything about a Zelda game is so well made, which leads me to the topic of today's video. There are 8 Zelda games on the Nintendo Switch, and I thought I'd rank them each from worst to best to see which one comes on top. This is just my opinion, but I've put many years into Zelda games, so I think I have a pretty good list. Remember to like and subscribe to the video, it would really help me out a lot. And there are massive spoilers for basically all the games on this list, so be warned. I will rank these games based on the worlds these games have, the dungeons inside these games, the story, and the gameplay. So, without any further ado, let's rank every single Zelda game on the Nintendo Switch. Now, there isn't a Zelda game out there that I've played that I hate. In fact, I like basically every Zelda game I've played, but Zelda 2 just doesn't hold up that much. It focuses a lot more on the RPG elements rather than the adventure, so automatically makes it the black sheep of the Zelda franchise. Now, the world of Zelda 2 definitely isn't that great either. The majesty of roaming around worlds like the original Legend of Zelda is gone in this game. Now you're just moving like a standard RPG character. I do prefer this world to the original Legend of Zelda though, mainly because of the use of towns. Towns are very nice and they help to make the world alive, and Zelda 2 did bring that into fruition. But other than that, there's really not much else to Zelda 2's world. The dungeons in Zelda 2 is very lacking as well. They're very huge and confusing and sprawling, and you're gonna get lost most of the time. But I wouldn't have a problem with that if there was a map. You basically have to do this entire thing blind, and that definitely doesn't help to make this game enjoyable. So that's really all I can say about the dungeons here. They're just long and confusing, and there's no way you can get better at them. Now, what I'm showing on screen right now is basically the extent of all the story you're going to get from just playing Zelda 2. There's not really much of a story at all, unless you read the manual, but if you're playing it now, you likely don't have the original copy. So, obviously, there's not much of a story to talk about. The gameplay of Zelda 2 isn't the worst if you're an RPG fan, but for a Zelda fan, you might not like it that much. It's infuriating, and it's kinda hard to understand, and as you're seeing on screen, I'm dying multiple times while recording this. I feel like it's pretty good off and on, but it's really only for a select few. Although it's extremely difficult, I feel like the sword combat in this game is really good for a 2D Zelda, even if it is on a side-scrolling plane, but that's really the extent of the praise I can give it. The original Legend of Zelda on the Nintendo Entertainment System is pretty good, but it definitely hasn't aged as well as some of the newer titles. The world of The Legend of Zelda is definitely a reason why it hasn't aged well, but not for the reason of Zelda 2. See, the world in the original Legend of Zelda definitely has aged well with newer titles like the Breath of the Wild trying to get that same feeling, but it hasn't aged well because you don't have a map, so it's hard to move around. Like, I understand this is a game that came out in 1985, but I think a map would have definitely helped make this game a top-tier Zelda game rather than just one that could have been really good. It's definitely not the worst Zelda world we've ever had, but it definitely could have helped if we had stuff like towns or more NPCs around the world. But I suppose that's not really the goal of the original Legend of Zelda. It does try to make you feel lost and alone, and it does a good job at that for all it can do. Zelda 1 does have a better dungeon system than Zelda 2 though. It does have smaller dungeons and they're very unoriginal, but it has a map so you can really tell the layout of the dungeon. That's really a big part of why I don't like Zelda 2. It has sprawling dungeons, but you have no idea where to go because there is no map. Like I said earlier, however, these dungeons are very unoriginal. They're basically the same thing every single time, just with a different color palette, whether it be gold or blue or green or whatever. It definitely would have helped if you had different themings or even a title rather than level 6 or level 4. Now, it's also just a massive enemy gauntlet, so there's not really any cool or unique puzzles other than the random block pushing puzzles or killing all the enemies in a room. So, puzzles in this dungeon isn't really helping, the aesthetics don't really help, but since it has a map, it's not that bad. Like Zelda 2, however, there is barely any story to this game. You have to look in the manual to find any, and what I'm showing on screen right now is the only story you're gonna get. gameplay is not the best either. The sword movement is only in 4 directions, so you basically have to play perfect in order not to die every 5 seconds, which I guess is part of its charm, but I really don't like heavy difficulty unless it's gameplay I actually enjoy. Dying at all is a pain in this game, because instead of going back to wherever you started, you basically had to go back to either the beginning of the dungeon or where you started out the game, and that's not really a recipe for success in my eyes. I do give it one thing, however. For a game that came out in 1986, moving around the world is immensely fun. I don't do it that often, but when I do, it's actually really fun. But when I look for what Zelda game I want to play, I'll be more inclined to go with the newer titles rather than this game. But for the first game in the Zelda series, it was pretty well made. Now, I've been fairly negative with the last 2 games, but trust me, I really like this game. From Zelda 2 to A Link to the Past, this game made a huge step, going more towards the original Legend of Zelda than Zelda 2, and the world definitely speaks to that. There are 2 massive interconnected worlds you can explore, and it's very fun to move around and see what you can find. Now, these worlds aren't just small, they are pretty big for a game that came out in the 90s, and these worlds might be the same world, but they're different enough to make it unique. It might not be the most engaging world in the Zelda series, but it definitely is one of the best. The dungeons? There's 12. To my count, there are 12 dungeons sprawled across Hyrule, and all of them are unique. And each dungeon, with the exception of the Ice Palace, is really well designed and it's really fun to explore. Now, the dungeons are unique and fun, but the theme that plays is not. It's the same thing for each of the 12 dungeons except Hyrule Castle, and it's just not my favorite. But that's really a minor issue. I don't really have any other issues with the dungeons, and they're pretty good, and a huge step above the other 2 games. A Link to the Past added something that the other 2 Zelda games didn't plan to add: a story. Might be kinda average, but hey, they finally added a fully fledged story. There's actually meaningful backstory that you don't just get from reading a manual. It's amazing. It does a really good job of setting up the events of the Downfall timeline, a branch of the Zelda timeline that Nintendo decided to add 20 years later. A Link to the Past story introduces Zelda staples such as the Master Sword, the 7 Sages, brings up the history of Ganon and Ganondorf. So although it might not be the most engaging story ever, it does a really good job of setting up future games. And Link to the Past has really good gameplay for a 2-dimensional Zelda game as well. You can still only swing your sword in 4 directions, but there's new items like the boomerang, the hook shot, that really broaden the experience and combat potential. They also added in a magic bar, which let Link do magic attacks with stuff like the fire rod or the ice rod. And although it's not necessary to have a magic bar in every Zelda game, it does fit really well in this game. New additions like the Heart Piece let Link get stronger partially by doing puzzles around the world so that he doesn't have to go into a dungeon with low health. Now, I could talk on and on about these new additions, but I think they speak for themselves, and that really helps Link to the Past be one of the greatest Zeldas. Now, Ocarina of Time, this low on the list, might surprise a lot of you. And I am no way saying this is a bad game by giving it its low rating. It just hasn't held up as well as the other titles. The world might be massive, but everything is so sprawled out from each other that it takes me so long just to get from one place to next, even when I'm riding Epona. The locations on the map, however, are pretty good. Lon Lon Ranch and Zora's Domain are always calming and fun to explore, but again, everything's just so far away from each other, it kinda takes away from the experience when it takes so long to get from one place to the next. Now, if the world were slightly smaller, or there was more stuff to do in the world, I wouldn't have a huge issue with this, but there's not. Outside of the locations you visit, the empty space between is just walking. But regardless of the spacing, it is still a really fun world. Now, the dungeons are where Ocarina of Time truly shines. Each of the dungeons are very memorable, which is a big reason why they're considered some of the best in the series. For example, the Forest Temple is very creepy and mysterious, so when you walk in, you instantly remember it of being so. And for a nearly 25-year-old game, the dungeons are very complex. I've honestly gotten stuck on dungeons like the Fire Temple and the Forest Temple. They might be difficult, but they're very rewarding when you beat them. Now, not every dungeon in this game is really good. For example, inside Jabu Jabu's belly is kinda average and gross looking, but even that, it's still pretty good and I could see someone enjoying it. The story is solid too. It's definitely not my favorite out of the Zelda series, but it still holds up. The game's main villain, Ganondorf, is used really well in Ocarina of Time and is really intimidating. Now, there are other good characters in Ocarina of Time as well, like Malon, Sheik, or Saria, but I feel like Ganondorf is definitely the best of the bunch. Now, every other character I didn't mention though is kinda hit or miss. They're either uninteresting or just not worth talking about, so the other characters obviously aren't as strong. Now, the themes of growing up and friendship are actually done pretty well here. Ocarina of Time definitely did a good job of bringing home its narrative. I've been pretty positive about Ocarina of Time up until this point, but this is where it stops. The actual gameplay of Ocarina of Time doesn't match the story, dungeons, or even the world. It is super janky no matter what you're doing, whether it's aiming a bow, using a sword, or even moving around. And it definitely doesn't help that the text boxes and menus are so slow in this game. It definitely hurts most when you're in the water temple, and you have to pause, move over, select the iron boots, leave the menu, do whatever you're gonna do, pause, unselect the iron boots, do whatever you're gonna do, rinse and repeat. It definitely takes away from the experience, and it's not fun. The frame rate at 20 definitely doesn't help either. Even the side quests aren't that good. There's not that many, and the ones they do have aren't that fun. I should say one positive, however. The newly added Z-targeting makes combat possible, and actually works pretty well even though the rest of the game is super janky. Now I could go on and on about all the negatives about Ocarina of Time's gameplay, but I won't here because I believe you've gotten the picture about all the issues about now, but it's still decent for what it is. Link's Awakening is the pinnacle of 2D Zelda for me. Every facet of this game is done as well as a 2D Zelda can do. Its world, though quaint in comparison to other games on this list, is jam-packed full of charm and density to make it a good world. Each locale is unique and really fun to explore, and I sometimes just find myself exploring this world. I especially love the heroic feel of Tal Tal Heights, or the peacefulness of May Village, to name a few. And there really isn't a boring location in this game. The dungeons here are very memorable too. Locations like the Face Shrine, Turtle Rock, and Eagle's Tower really help the feel of the game due to the aesthetics and unique themes. The Face Shrine specifically is really well done here. The aesthetic and themes of the dungeons really help drive the tone of what you just witnessed. You saw a placard earlier in the dungeon saying that if you beat the game, the island will disappear along with all of its residents. The dungeons here might not be the most complicated we've seen in the entire series, but they're good for what they're worth. The story of Link's Awakening is definitely where this game shines. Instead of other Zelda games that want you to beat the final boss and beat the game, this game makes you not want to beat the game that much, because once you do, the islanders that you've gone to know so well will just disappear, along with the island itself. It's not like these characters are just random NPCs. These are people that you grow to care about in the course of the game. I swear, the amount of storytelling this game that originally came out in 1993 managed to do is absolutely absurd. The story may be simple at first, but it's a really amazing story nonetheless. The gameplay of Link's Awakening is very similar to that of A Link to the Past, but there's nothing wrong with that. Link to the Past had amazing gameplay, and definitely carries over to Link's Awakening. Link's Awakening has the perfect difficulty and length balance for a two-dimensional Zelda game. It's not super long, but it's also not super short, and it's also not super hard, but it's not a pushover either. Link's Awakening's most defining gameplay feature, in my opinion, was the Rock's Feather, which let Link jump over gaps, which made new dungeon opportunities. And there's not really any negatives to Link's Awakening's gameplay either. It's really solid. Skyward Sword is very special for me because it was the first Legend of Zelda game that I've ever beaten. But I do admit it has some very severe issues. However, as many flaws as Skyward Sword has, it has even greater strengths. The world, however, is kinda average in my opinion. Outside of the areas like Skyloft, Faron, Lanayru, or Eldin, every other location is hit or miss. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't strong areas outside of the main four I just mentioned. I'm just saying they're all very spread out and kinda suffer the same fate that Ocarina of Time did, where the world is huge, but every key landmark and fun thing to do is so spread out from each other that it's a slog to get from one place to the next. A positive about the world, though, is that each facet of the world is very gorgeous to look at. That statement extends to the dungeons as well. Each dungeon in this game is absolutely gorgeous and is very stylistically unique. From the eeriness of Skyview Temple to the mechanical feel of La Neighbor Mining Facility, each dungeon stands out and is very memorable in its own right. One thing I really appreciate about Skyward Sword is expansion on dungeon mechanics. A couple good examples being in a sand ship when you change the time to change the layout of the dungeon, or in Skykeep when you literally change the layout of the dungeon rooms. I'm trying to think of a negative when it comes to Skyward Sword's dungeons, and I can't. There is not one dungeon that is bad in this game. Skyward Sword's story is 100% its biggest strength. This is one of the first Zelda games, in my opinion, that made you really want to save Zelda by developing their friendship in the prologue. Skyward Sword does a really good job developing each and every one of their characters. Even Fi gets a development at the end of the game. And the person that develops the most is the school bully Groose. Groose obviously goes from a bully to being one of the biggest heroes of the game. And it does help that Groose is one of the greatest characters ever to walk the face of the earth. Its main villain is so good in this game. Girahim is one of the funniest and creepiest villain I've ever seen in a video game ever. Now, the gameplay of Skyward Sword is where people tend to disagree a lot. Its main gameplay feature, the ability to swing your controller like you're actually Link in the game, is very divisive around fans. I personally didn't mind it so much, but I could see why some of you would. Its linear gameplay didn't really bother me that much, except in the second act when you'd constantly be having to fly up between Skyloft and Farron, but that didn't really take away from the experience for me. Skyward Sword has a very fun item set here, with items like the Gust Bellows being an easy vacuum cleaner, or the double claw shots making Link feel like Spider-Man. And overall, it's pretty fun gameplay. Might not be for everyone, but for me, I really enjoyed it. Now, I said before that Ocarina of Time had very janky gameplay, a very empty and oversized world, and an alright story. Majora's Mask expands on its predecessor in probably one of the best sequels I've ever seen in a video game. Now, first off, its world. Its world, though smaller compared to Ocarina of Time's, is less empty compared to Ocarina because there's a lot more side content to do. And that helps to make the world feel more alive than Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask's central hub, and its best feature, Clock Town, is full of interesting NPCs to talk to and fun minigames, and you'll end up spending more time here than a usual Zelda town. Majora's Mask dungeons are also pretty limited, but that's not really to its downfall either. Each dungeon is really well made, and is some of the best in the series. Each of the 4 dungeons brings a new and interesting mechanic to their dungeons. For example, in Stone Tower Temple, by the press of a switch, you can literally flip the dungeon on its head. Another example being in the Great Bay Temple, when you can reverse the water direction. So basically what I'm getting at here is that, although there is less dungeons compared to Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask doesn't lose any quality. In fact, I believe it matches the quality of Ocarina of Time's dungeons. Now, there's one dungeon mechanic I did not really like in Majora's Mask. The stray fairies. See, these great fairies ask you to collect all the stray fairies in the dungeon so that you will be able to get a reward at the end of it. Now, on paper that sounds fine, but it's the rewards I'm not too happy with. See, it's not like their rewards aren't good enough, it's that they are good enough. They are way too useful that I would have preferred just to get those rewards somewhere else in the world. For example, in my playthrough, I just went to the Snowhead Temple, and I was deciding if I was going to get the Stray Fairies or not, and I decided against it because I probably don't need it. But it was an expanded magic meter, that's the only expanded magic meter you can get the entire game, and by the end of the game, you're using magic so much that it would just be a waste of time not to get it. Sure, you could theoretically beat the game not getting any of the rewards, but the rewards are so useful that it ends up being not an optional thing to do in the dungeons, but almost mandatory. Now, people that have played Majora's Mask have talked about the story to death, but it is definitely the best part of Majora's Mask, so how could I not talk about it? Majora's Mask goes for a more grim and sad story compared to the more lighthearted approach of other games in the series, and I really appreciate this aspect of the game. Even taking away all the side content this game has, the main premise of the story is to stop the moon from crashing into the Earth in just 3 days. Now, I praised Link's Awakening earlier for having great characterization, but Majora's Mask just blows that out of the water. The side characters are where Majora's Mask gets its main portion of its story. You learn about each of the side characters' lives, and it generally makes you want to help them. But the sad thing is you can't. No matter how fast you go, you can only help a select few people, leading to a bittersweet and amazing ending. Now, Majora's Mask is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, and I covered that game earlier on this list, saying it had janky gameplay. Well, Majora's Mask fixes a lot of that janky gameplay. Sure, the base movement is the same, so obviously not the greatest, but they added things to make the movement of Link funner and better. Additions like the bunny hood increased Link's normal walking speed, and let me tell you how happy I was to finally get that item. The transformation masks, letting Link turn into 3 of the main races of Hyrule, Deku, Goron, or Zora, help Link have new movement opportunities, as well as making the gameplay feel more alive. Now, I said earlier that Majora's Mask had a 3-day time cycle, that if Link didn't beat the game in that, it would be a game over. But there is an ability to turn back time, but with a twist. You lose all your items and all your rupees that you did not store away, which is one of my favorite things about Majora's Mask because it brought an element of time management into the fray. Its side quests are one of the better things about Majora's Mask. It lets you learn about all the NPCs around Clocktown, and it gave you good rewards that would help you out later in the game, as well as giving you story details and making you determined to beat the game. Some of my favorite side quests being the Alien Invasion and the Anju Cafe side quest. And overall, everything else is improved here too, and that's why it's number 2 on this list. I'm guessing it's no surprise to anyone that Breath of the Wild is number 1 on this list. It's an open-world Zelda, with the world being the best part about the game. The world is so massive, and you can do anything in any order. There are so many different ways you can go about progressing the game, and I bet that if I asked 10 people, they'd all have a different way of saying how they progress through the game. You can spend 75 plus hours before you beat the final boss, or you could spend an hour before you beat the boss. It is truly up to you, and it's truly the magic of this game. So many interesting locations, so many different movement options through the world. It is truly an alive place, and there really isn't that much flaws with it, except the rain. The rain does make it hard to climb whenever it rains, but that's more of an annoyance than an actual problem with it. It's not like Ocarina of Time where it's a barren wasteland either. It's really fun to explore, and there's a bunch of collectibles and stuff to do here. The dungeons, however, are an issue. The one I'm showing you on screen right now is the best of the bunch, Hyrule Castle, but the other 4, the Divine Beasts, are very similar in design and aesthetics that it almost becomes hard to tell which is which, and that just makes most of the dungeons forgettable, which is not something a good Zelda should have. The story is fine. It's definitely not the best part of the game, but it does what it needs to do. The bulk of the story happens 100 years in the past through Link's forgotten memories, which you can collect in any order by going around and finding them in the world. Let me reiterate that it does its job fine, but it's not as interesting or as good as a usual Zelda story can get. Breath of the Wild did add voice acting, however, and it's about 50-50. Some of them are really good, but some of the other ones, like Yunobo, are really bad. In the present-day Hyrule, however, there isn't much for story beats except for certain side quests like the Dorian side quest. But in the end, you're not playing Breath of the Wild for the story, you're playing it for the gameplay and the world. The gameplay of Breath of the Wild is immensely fun. Link feels amazing to move around, and doing stuff like aiming a bow midair or paragliding makes me come back to the game to not actually do anything, but just to roam around. The combat in this game is so fun. There's so much freedom you get to do when you choose how to best an enemy, and I really like fighting enemies because of that. Now, perhaps my favorite part of Breath of the Wild's gameplay is the new rune abilities added. They let Link do stuff like moving magnetic objects or creating ice on water. And that's kind of my point. Every aspect of Breath of the Wild just makes me come back, even after I've beaten the final boss. And that is what makes this the best Zelda game on the Nintendo Switch. Thanks so much for watching this video. I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope you enjoyed it. The Zelda series is amazing, and I highly recommend it to anybody that wants to get into video games. I hope you will look forward to my next upload, and I'll see you all next time.